While those surveys are being handed out, we'll start with the session. So I'm going to call Trudy Banta back for to talk about assessment, which obviously right from the beginning of the day we were very keen to hear about. So Trudy.
Clearly, after that last session, we have experts in the room on this subject, and they will be, I'm sure, wonderful assistance for you as you make this journey. But I'm also aware that a number of you have said that now that you have learning outcomes in place, you really need to begin to do assessments. So there are some of you who are beginning to think about this. So I hope that some of what I have to say will be helpful. Again, I want to begin with a definition, and this is my own. I think it's a process, outcomes assessment, and I talk about outcomes assessment to distinguish it from all the other kinds of assessment that you can think of. And so outcomes assessment for me is a process of providing credible evidence. Credible is important because we can't wait for the perfectly reliable or valid instrument. We need to start with something that we can begin to believe in and then make it better. So credible evidence of not just outcomes, but also the resources and the implementation processes that go into producing outcomes. Because if you just know about outcomes and you don't know about the resources that went into the process, or about the teaching methods or the technological assistance that was available, then you don't know where to begin to try to correct any weaknesses that you find in the outcomes. And I say that outcomes assessment is undertaken for the purpose of improving effectiveness of instruction and programs and services in higher education. I know that we may undertake it to demonstrate accountability to governments or to accreditors, but I think if we undertake it for our own purposes of continuous improvement of our programs, that the rest will take care of itself. At least I hope that's the case. So from that definition, again, it's at various levels. It all begins with one student in a classroom. If you look across students in a class, you can get classroom outcomes and look at strengths and weaknesses of a group of students. If you sit down with your colleagues who are in the same discipline and look across courses, you may find particular weaknesses that you can work on together, like writing or quantitative reasoning. Then departments within a college, the campus may do surveys of alumni, of enrolled students, and you can have means at the college or campus level and then means at the department level that can be compared, and going on up to provincial and national levels. Here is an example, one example of a few I'll give of assessment at the course level. And this is called various things: classroom assessment, fast feedback. You simply ask at the end of the class, what's the most important thing you learned today, what's still not clear, and can you make any suggestions about the assignments or the way the material was presented that might be helpful. And then making change based on what you learn. And this can be done electronically just before a class, a couple of hours before a class, so that you have just-in-time teaching, because you can answer the questions that students have about their assignments. Primary trait scoring is another example of an assessment technique that can be used at the course level. This is a method that has been used in scoring essays by the Educational Testing Service. You identify those traits that are going to make an assignment successful. What are the components of an assignment? And then compose a rubric in order to define each of those points at various levels, and then grade using the rubric. For instance, a research paper might have the parts of, or the traits of, defining the topic and doing an outline, a first draft, a final draft, and an oral presentation. If you use defining points as along a continuum of unacceptable, acceptable, outstanding, and then describe each of those and give this description to students, this is very helpful to them in constructing their assignment and very helpful to you in grading it. And so if you give the students something that looks like this with one check for their performance, but make a check every time you give a student a check, then at the end of the assignment, you know where the strengths and weaknesses of the group lie. And here we find that students are very good at developing an outline, all outstanding, not so good at the oral defense. And I've talked about oral defense several times today. And so if you were doing a curriculum map with your outcomes listed and then all the courses listed across the page, column headings, and you look at something like number 7, well, let's look first at number 1. There seem to have been lots of opportunities in the coursework for students to practice perhaps developing an outline. So no surprise that they were very good at developing an outline when you put that on as a criterion. But look at number 7. This may be that the only time the students had to give an oral performance was in that freshman speech course that they had to take. And so just doing this curriculum map before you've ever even given anything to students might tell you that not enough opportunities to practice this if oral presentations is going to be important. Another way to use rubrics, you can give students a group project and then observe them and rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, how well they listen, contribute to discussion, challenge others, and explain or propose solutions. Now, here, I know that in your survey, many of you said we don't have a critical mass of faculty engaged in learning outcome work and assessment. And one of the reasons, I think, is that we are solo practitioners as we get our advanced degrees, and we specialize in a small area. And outcomes assessment requires collaboration in every step in determining what the outcomes will be, in developing the curriculum, choosing measures, and then interpreting findings, and then figuring out what to do to make improvements. All requires getting together with colleagues and talking about what's important. So I say, let's find ways to engage faculty, and there are many ways, and we need to know all of them. But curiosity is one. If we make a change in the curriculum or in the way of teaching, is the old way better than the new way, or the new way, vice versa? One way to find out is to assess student learning of the appropriate skills at the beginning with the old approach, and then again with the new approach, and see if there are differences in the right direction. Some of the questions that we may be interested in: if we undertake a new approach, is instruction perceived as being more effective by both faculty and students? Are students learning more? Are they more satisfied? And do the outcomes justify the costs? Another way to look at this is that at various times, faculty will be interested in various things, and if there are ways to connect outcomes assessment with things that they value, like, for instance, a change in the core curriculum, that is the place then to try to connect outcomes assessment. It may be strategic planning for the department. It might be program review. It might be the scholarship of teaching and learning in order to do an article for a SOTL journal, you need assessment information. Faculty development, I've made that point several times, that is so important in this process. And then link it to promotion and tenure. Whatever we do, this is going to need strong administrative support. You've heard that over and over today from those who have been working in this vineyard. Resources for professional development, recognition and promotion and tenure processes, collecting and storing data, and resources for making change. I saw a reference to the work of Charlie Blach at the Wabash Center on Inquiry, and he says you need to start with the idea that you're going to devote as many resources to effecting change when you finish the project as you do in supporting the data collection and analysis going into outcomes assessment. And I firmly believe that it takes a campus to produce a graduate. We even need to have our departmental secretaries keyed into some of the things that we want to accomplish with our students, because they may spend more time talking with students than the department chair does while they're waiting to see the department chair. And so I think it's so important to think about involving our student affairs staff. They can help us with assessment. They can look at, for instance, in a freshman writing course, students have to write an essay every week. Let it be about a service that they have encountered on campus in their first year, and let the grading of the writing be by the instructor, and have student affairs professionals read to see what the students are thinking about the services that they're encountering. So a good way for them to help assess learning. They can also assess what's going on with the students that are doing things like being residence hall counselors or working in the campus center. Student affairs professionals these days are getting a lot of work in assessment and surveys, interviews, focus groups. They know how to do these things. So call on them for that expertise. And then when you're interpreting findings, they can help decide what campus services need to be improved and in what way. Engaging students is incredibly important. And again, I'm so glad that we have students here, because they need to be participants in this assessment business. So we can stress the importance of engaging in looking at doing surveys, taking surveys, responding to questionnaires, focus groups, interviews. So we can tell them about this in recruiting and orienting them. We can ask students to help us collect data. Understand that at one of your institutions, there's been a Harvard-like assessment seminar where students and faculty get together and gather some data and talk about what it means. So students can help design and administer questionnaires, interpret the data, and then help decide how the data will be used to improve, and disseminating the fact that the data have been used to improve. Very important. Employers, we were just talking about that a few minutes ago, they can help in looking over our shoulders as we develop learning outcomes, collecting data from students. They can help us do interviews and focus groups with our students and with our graduates and feed the information back to us. They certainly supervise internships, and if we give them a rubric that is focused on our own learning outcomes, they can assess our students in the internships along with faculty and students themselves. They can help us evaluate papers and projects and presentations. I have a professor at the Indiana University that has done a capstone course for students in business, and they must design a presentation of a product that will appeal to venture capitalists. If they are not able to convince someone in a group of venture capitalists who are listening to fund their project, they don't get credit for that course and they don't graduate. until they take that course and pass it. High stakes. Faculty and staff development, we can actually bring faculty and student affairs professionals together to attend conferences and workshops like this one, read literature and talk about it, and take part in grants and summer projects. Here's my slide about not all faculty are trained as teachers, and so we need professional development. This morning I talked about the need to have that development to write clear objectives using action verbs, and then assessment tools that will test higher order intellectual skills. Let me mention now individualizing instruction using a variety of methods and materials. And we can not only individualize instruction, but also the way that we conduct our assessment methods. So here are some of the things that might happen in a professional development activity. Learning that we must match our teaching and our assessment with our goals and objectives for student learning. We can't rely on any one method to give us totally reliable and valid information, so we need multiple measures, both direct and indirect. And by direct and indirect, I mean direct measures of learning that take place in projects and papers and tests. Indirect measures help us understand why scores may be high or low. And that's when we give questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups to ask students how they are experiencing their instruction. And we look at syllabi and transcripts to see if the assignments match the learning outcomes. Qualitative and quantitative measures. Sometimes we can give a pre-test and then a post-test to look at what students have learned. It's not always practical or effective, but when it is, it's a good thing to do. And use built-in points of contact with students, not having to round them up on a Saturday morning as I had to do when I was at the University of Tennessee and give them a test that is not very meaningful to them. So I say start with the measures that you have, the assignments, the tests, observations of work performance, records of progress through the curriculum, be that a curricular or an extracurricular transcript, and add things like portfolios and observations, whether that be of real or simulated practice, case studies, attitude and belief inventories, and interviews, focus groups, and surveys. And this, I think, is a nice tool for you to use to organize any kind of evaluation. And that is, what is it you want in general for students to develop, like communication skills? How would you know it if you saw it? They would be able to defend a research proposal effectively, orally. How will you help them learn it? And this is the important thing about matching assignments with the learning outcomes. Then how would you measure it? And if you use an action verb to say how you'll know it if you see it, then that will help you determine how to measure. And then what are the findings and what do you do about those findings in order to continuously improve programs and services? Now I want to tell you a story about some experience that I've had. And the point of this will be to, I hope, encourage you not to go down this road, not to make some of the mistakes that we've made in the States. In 2006, Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings appointed a commission to look at higher education and the future thereof. They came out with a report in September of '06. And it said, among other things, we need a simple way to compare institutions and to look at value added from freshman to senior year. So some of the powers that be in Washington decided that we would do it to ourselves before the feds did it to us. So the voluntary system of accountability that idea was hatched. And I was called to Washington in January of 2007 to sit with a dozen people, there were 11 others, to find ways to assess student learning so that we could compare institutions. And when we got there, I thought we could have spent the whole 6 months that we'd been given just defining what we meant by student learning. But no, we were told in the first 3 minutes that we would be looking at critical thinking, written communication, and analytic reasoning. And so I said, what if only one test will do this? And they said, oh, if we find several tests that do those things, we'll build crosswalks like they do with the ACT and the SAT exams. We'll just make them equivalent. So I thought this was a terrible idea. Everything about that rubbed me the wrong way. And why was that? Because at the University of Tennessee, I had the opportunity several years before that to administer the very same 4 instruments that were recommended by this group of a dozen that I was part of. The Collegiate Assessment of Academic Proficiency from ACT, the Academic Profile, which is now the Proficiency Profile from ETS, the Comp Exam, which has been withdrawn, but the Collegiate Learning Assessment, very much like that, and College Base from the University of Missouri. College Base people, the developers of that said, we think that the value-added measure that you're contemplating using is unethical. We will not be part of this, so they withdrew, and we had only 3 tests to go forward. So why was I against all of this, using these tests to measure, look at institutional performance and compare it? Because we had studied these tests in Tennessee, and we had learned that no test measures even 30% of the skills in general education that our faculty think are important. These tests of generic skills like writing and critical thinking measure primarily what students bring to college with them, not what happens while they're there. The reliability of value added is negligible. These test scores in and of themselves give few clues as to what improvements might be made. It's hard to motivate students to take these tests if they don't have any stakes associated with them. So fast forward to the present, and we find that indeed the correlation between the CLA scores at the institution level and SAT averages for each institution is nearly perfect. So that means if you square 0.9 and get 81% of the variance in institution-wide scores is due to students' prior learning. So that other 19%, what comes out of that? Well, the same things that come out of the rest of the 81%: age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, transfer status, college major, student motivation to do well, sampling and measurement error, test anxiety, and the effects of colleges and universities. So I think to bring student comparisons on the basis of these measures is not a valid use of those tests, and I hope you can take that away. Let's look at just a few of those things that go into influencing these scores. Samples of freshmen and seniors are being recommended to be used. Cash and prizes are being used to bring students in to take the tests, but we know that only intrinsic motivation and a requirement will help seniors arrive and do their best work. Interestingly, some of the test developers sort of poo-pooed the idea that motivation was very important in these scores until 2012, when the ETS staffers themselves did a control study and found that indeed student motivation is a clear predictor of test performance and value-added scores. So there went that one. And then someone from the Council on Aid to Education that develops the Collegiate Learning Assessment did a study and found that the choice of value-added model, if you're looking at value-added, can affect the results. He used one-way hierarchical linear modeling with CLA scores and found reliability of value-added at only 0.75. He said it really needs to be 0.8 if we're going to make high stakes comparisons among institutions. And so that one goes down the drain. And you might say, why didn't you just resign from the task force when you had the opportunity? Because I complained at every single meeting. We were there 6 times, and I just told them all of the things that could go wrong and that they really needed to do some studies to follow up. And I've just talked with you about some of those studies that have been done. The first thing they did, I'm glad to say, is to get a grant from the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education to find out if those tests, the 3 tests that they were using, were actually equivalent. They found that they were related but not equivalent, so the idea of building the crosswalk so that you could use any test and it would be comparable with any of the others, that went out the window. So the other good thing that happened with this study is that AAC&U, American Association of Colleges and Universities, got to use this as a way of testing and developing their value rubrics. That's valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education. There are 16 of those, and they are well worth looking at. So here was my conclusion, and I hope that you will take this away, that looking at these currently available standardized tests of generic skills like writing and critical thinking to compare the quality of institutions is not a valid use of those tests. If we must measure learning, I think we should use standardized tests in major fields: internship performance, projects, electronic portfolios, external examiners, authentic measures. We like the idea of an electronic portfolio because students can own that process, taking responsibility for the skills that they are developing, reflecting on those, getting metacognitive thinking practice, doing that, using multiple ways of expressing themselves, writing, photographs, videos, and using rubrics, locally developed or the value rubrics from AAC&U. If we do that, we could do something, a report like this, that would look very much like standardized test scores, saying 85% of our students have outstanding ratings in writing, and this is how we define it, or 75% are outstanding in delivering an oral presentation. I want to end with 2 examples of use to improve. San Diego State, using the electronic portfolios, their master's and doctoral students come in and say what they would like to accomplish. They write their own learning outcomes. And then at the end of their program, or well, throughout it, they're keeping an electronic portfolio. They're taking measures of their learning in the curriculum and in the co-curriculum. And then they make oral presentations of what faculty call synthesized learning. This is evaluated by faculty and professionals who come in for this presentation session. And over time, synthesized learning has improved as a result of this authentic measure. And one other example from community colleges in California, they have gone back to that very simple CAT, the classroom assessment technique, and they have simply asked students to give them anonymous written comments with suggestions about instruction, and the faculty have been responding to those suggestions, and they have found that student retention has increased. They give more A's. More females have been interested in STEM courses. Students, especially diverse students, like the method, and faculty are increasing their teaching effectiveness, listening to students. Thank you.
Stay with us in case. So, as usual, five minutes for questions of Trudy. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask right off the bat? Up.
Hi there. So my name's Stephen. I'm from the U of C, and I'm a student. So in that example about the freshman writing practices, how did you go about creating or developing a culture where assessment is used for those multiple purposes?
Developing the culture. There's so many answers to that question. But of course, you begin by orienting students and faculty to the idea that assessment is going to be important and that someone is going to be looking at the results and actually taking action based on it. There also needs to be trust in that atmosphere. And trust means that if we find unhappy results, students are not learning or they don't like a particular service, the response will be positive. It will be, we take that information, we use it to get better. We don't use it to punish. So that's another thing. Openness about results. I found a university when I came to IUPUI in '92 where already financial information for all of the various units was on the web. And that is, it was available, and then finally by 2000 it was on the web. And we've done the same thing with all of our survey responses. We have put them out with campus averages, and then you can see what every school average is on every item. And so when you have 50% of the schools always being below average on some item, it makes a lot of atmosphere for wanting to improve. And I think over time, our student satisfaction with things like advising has gone up as a result of that, because those 50% of the units that were below the campus average have tried to come up, and the ocean has raised all boats.
One more. Yeah, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Goldberg again from Mount Royal University. You mentioned earlier on, and then it just came up in your last answer, about student satisfaction. And student satisfaction, and you mentioned it in relation earlier on, you mentioned in relation to student learning. And student satisfaction sometimes is at cross purposes or not correlated with student learning. And a great example that probably many of us have experienced is teachers who engage in riskier or newer pedagogies, some of which where there's very strong literature showing the student learning outcomes are improved, that often doesn't satisfy students, some of that engagement in newer or riskier pedagogies. So how do we think through this tension in this area?
Well, that's a great point. It's not just student satisfaction, that we're after. Student satisfaction can be a good indicator of something that for instance, financial aid. If students are not, if they're being in long lines and not getting to see a counselor and not getting good advice, we need to know that. And if students' papers are months in being returned, it's good to know that they're dissatisfied with that, and we can move on that. But there are other things that we can do with surveys. One in particular that I'm very high on is, instead of asking students how satisfied they are with the teacher, asking if they have in fact experienced assignments and assessment that go along with the learning outcomes for the course. And I think that can be done at midterm. It can also be done as a separate thing from the evaluation of instructors at the end of a course. And having students come back and say, critical thinking, I never did hear that mentioned, and yet that was a learning outcome. So I think we can ask other questions that get at something that's deeper and more involving and important than just satisfaction. But satisfaction can be important too.